Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, can we just take a second to acknowledge the fact that we're about a week and a half, less than 2 weeks away from July, which means the year is practically over halfway done. And my one question at the moment is, where has the time gone? Because I swear this year has just flown by like that, honestly. And can we just catch a break? Can we just catch a motherfucking break? Anybody else? Just me? No, I'm pretty sure it's not just me. Well, speaking of catching a break, you know who couldn't catch a break? Schizophrenic patients in 1983. Today, we're looking at the UCLA Schizophrenia Medication Experiment, an experiment that was initially created to gain a better understanding of the mental illness, resulted in patients suffering and even death. What's even more interesting about this study is that it doesn't exactly have an ending to it. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy-tozy and let's jump into it. So before we jump into the experiment, let's talk a little bit about what it means to have schizophrenia and what it means to be schizophrenic. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that affects how people think, feel, and behave, and does affect about 1% of the US population. This mental illness can cause people to interpret reality in a very abnormal way compared to someone who doesn't have schizophrenia, and it can be severe and disabling in its most serious cases. Schizophrenia is often recognized by some of its most common symptoms, which include hallucinations, delusions, and paranoid thoughts. However, there is so much more to unpack about schizophrenia that it's so much that I'm not even going to be scratching the surface in this one episode, because there's so much more than just the stereotypical voices in your head sometimes. People who are diagnosed with schizophrenia may worry that it'll drastically and unrepairably disable their lives forever. However, since it is on the spectrum, that does not always ring true for every single patient. Those diagnosed with schizophrenia, whether it be earlier in life or later in life, can still definitely live out a full and highly productive life. There is no cure for schizophrenia, but there are ways to help the patient control their symptoms. This include lifestyle changes such as finding a job that requires less cognitive stress from the person, psychological treatments like individual and family therapy, and, of course, prescription medications such as antipsychotic drugs. Today's study focuses more on that last treatment, the antipsychotic medication. So in 1983, there were still very little advancements in the medical field regarding treatment for schizophrenic patients. You see, we were still in the era where we would just throw all mentally ill patients into asylums and essentially just forget about them. You see, for a number of years, patients with debilitating diseases have been volunteering to take personal risks, all to advance knowledge in the name of science. Okay, so we all know and understand that it's completely inhumane to test on human subjects, right? But sadly, there are some areas that we cannot gain advanced knowledge on without studying on human subjects, particularly in the field of mental health. And in 1983, UCLA knew this and decided to take full advantage. And let's welcome to the stage psychologist Dr. Keith H. Nerklin and psychiatrist Dr. Michael Gitlin, both employees at the UCLA Medical Center in 1983. These two were interested in looking at the ways in which those who suffer with schizophrenia relapse, and were trying to find out if there are any predictors to their psychosis. Essentially, they wanted to see how effective or not their medication was, and if on or off their medication there are any predictors to their symptoms. Okay, again, so we understand that testing on human subjects is completely inhumane, right? But the researchers' justification for this study was that schizophrenia medication had so many side effects that they wanted to see if they were worth it and if they could provide the patients a different kind of aid to avoid said side effects from said medication. Again, essentially, do the pros of the medication outweigh the cons? Some believe that the UCLA researchers had good intentions to begin with. Schizophrenia medications are known to have pretty bad side effects such as involuntary muscle spasms or stiffness, high blood pressure problems, heart problems, and in severe cases, death. Kind of sounds like those antidepressant commercials, you know, the ones I'm talking about, where the guy with the very commercially voice goes on to list a giant list of side effects to the antidepressant, but it's okay because at the end you see people laughing as if they don't want to unalive themselves anymore. Anyways, if we're being honest, no medication comes without any side effects. Like, otherwise there wouldn't be a need for big pharma, am I right? The researchers' plan was to take 50 schizophrenia patients who were currently on prescription medication, take them off their medication for an extended period of time, test how long they can go without relapsing, then put them back on their medication if they saw the need to. And that is big on the if they saw the need to. Their main goal was to find out if it was possible for schizophrenic patients to be better off their medication. Now remember, this was 1983, so researchers did now require for the patients to give consent to participate in the study. They had all the medicated patients sign informed consent documents stating that they understood that in the experiment their symptoms may, quote, improve, worsen, or remain unchanged, unquote. However, the patients weren't exactly told how severe the relapses might be in the case that their symptoms were to worsen. This includes the possibility of suffering increasingly severe symptoms with each recurrence, meaning their symptoms may become worse than they were before they even started taking their medication. Honestly, God bless these individuals because they were literally risking their health for what they thought was the greater good. As I mentioned, the research method was essentially take the patients off their medications, watch their behavior to predict whether or not they would go into psychosis, and if they did, put them back on their medication. Sounds simple enough, right? And in a way, it could have been had the researchers done their data collecting correctly and ethically. One of the biggest issues was that the researchers failed to plan a suitable timeline in which their test subjects could safely return to their medications. The researchers just kind of played it by ear and vibes at this point, honestly. Did the patient look like they were about to go crazy? If they did, write that down and maybe just keep a closer eye on them just to make sure it wasn't just a moment of weakness. Because in the case that they did end up going crazy, they may consider giving them their medication back. Just maybe, just something to keep on the table, right? Do we see the issue here once we put it into layman's terms? Yes? Okay, good. So it's not just me. Now, as you could imagine, the experiments weren't as successful as the researchers were hoping they'd be. As mentioned, even though the patients were each given consent forms, when the Federal Office of Protection from Research Risks looked through the consent form that was officially handed to the patients, nowhere did they see that it was ever specified how severe these relapses could potentially be. When they pointed this out to the researchers, the researchers, claimed that specific information was given orally. And I'm sorry, okay, but that is just the lamest excuse I've ever heard. There is no way that this kind of information could not have been written down on the consent form. It seems pretty important to have it in writing and then signed off on, given that it's kind of the whole point of the experiment. No? Anyone? Just me? The researchers were able to get away with these lackluster consent forms because, according to them, the study included what they called a clinical override. This meant that the patients were, quote, immediately evaluated at any given moment that they so much as showed the most minor symptoms of psychosis and were immediately given their medication. Again, I guess sounds pretty clear, but was it well thought out? Just think about it for a second, okay? Take the schizophrenic patient off their medication, watch them. If they go psychotic, give them their medication back. I'm just having a really hard time imagining a group of doctors going, yeah, that sounds foolproof. And then the review board going, yeah, that sounds credible. Go ahead, go for it. But back to the results, I guess. So technically, the study lasted from 1983 to 1994. In those 9 years, the researchers found very little valuable information. In most cases, it was impossible for the subjects to stay off the medication, and the effects of relapsing and being off the medication were far worse than the initial side effects that were already present when taking the medication. And it wasn't like a one-time thing either. A number of patients suffered multiple relapses that included a heightened amount of hallucinations and paranoia. Do you know what this implies? It means that even after a patient showed signs that they could not be without their medications, the researchers would either put them back on the medication and then take them off again, or they would ignore the initial relapse, not providing them back their medication, where the patient would then just get worse and worse over time. In fact, the experiment actually made things worse for some of the patients. Dr. Keith H. Nerklin, the psychologist, remember him, wrote in his review that patients often refused the medication and it was difficult to determine clinically how severe the relapse could be. Again, who could have predicted something like this could ever happen? But probably their most compelling cases against the study is that of two patients, Gregory Aller and Antonio Lamadrid, known as Greg and Tony. Both Greg and Tony were students at UCLA and subjects of the schizophrenia experiment. Greg is an exemplary example of the successful life someone with schizophrenia can still achieve with proper care and medication. The first years of the study, Greg was an excellent student, earning his bachelor's and maintaining a 3.8 GPA at UCLA. But in 1989, a few years into the study, the researchers decided it was time to take him off his medication and see what happens. Then, in 1990, after being off his medication for a few months, Greg dropped out of school, threatened to kill his mother with a butcher knife, and started to hitchhike his way to Washington, D.C. to assassinate then President Bush because the aliens in his head had ordered him to so that he could become the new president of the United States. However, he only made it a few miles east where he used his only $2 to call his dad to come pick him up. And then we have the case of Antonio Lamadrid, aka Tony, also a student and schizophrenia patient at UCLA. Like Greg, he entered the experiment medicated and continued with his medication for the first few years until the researchers believed it was time to take him off the medication and observe his reactions. Soon after he was taken off his medication, Tony began to talk fondly about suicide to his family. His family obviously noticed this and they tried to kind of comfort him out of it. They also tried to reach out to the UCLA research team, but the team wouldn't reveal any information about Tony as a test subject because they told him that the only people allowed to that information were Tony's parents, which was difficult because both of his parents were deceased at the time. The research team wouldn't even consider Tony's biological brothers as immediate family. Just another red flag. When his family noticed that Tony's suicide threats kept getting more and more out of hand, and that the research team at UCLA were clearly not taking it seriously, they tried to reach out to Tony, but he wasn't answering his phone. And this was a time before cell phones, okay? So the family had to drive to UCLA campus where he was staying, but when they arrived on March 28th, 1991, they were 15 minutes too late. Tony had leaped to his death from a building on the UCLA campus. Both families joined forces to rightfully sue the UCLA Medical Center. They were convinced that their loved ones, Greg and Tony, were abused by federally funded research that put scientific objectives ahead of treatment. They argued that the researchers deliberately allowed patients to relapse and risk permanent setbacks while under the false consensus of a safety net. The researchers' defense was that they provided the patients with consent forms that they signed stating that they understood that, quote, "My condition may improve, worsen, or remain unchanged. I may benefit from this study by being taken off medication in a careful way while under close medical supervision," unquote. Furthermore, the researchers contended that they always followed clinical standards, monitored their subjects, and provided access to medication during relapses. As we've clearly seen, this is not the full scope of the case because the patients were never told to what degree the relapses could be. Sadly, in 1994, Superior Court Judge David D. Perez dismissed the case because the families had exceeded the 5-year statute of limitations on bringing charges to trial. Now, although the lawsuit didn't exactly have the happiest of endings for the families, it did help to bring us to where we are today. Experts criticized the study as an experiment in cold turkey withdrawal from medication. An expert of the Citizens for Responsible Care in Psychiatry and Research Agency was quoted saying, "Whatever happened to the doctor's foremost ethical pledge to do no harm? It's not surprising that they had a relapse. It's expected. It's unethical." Unquote. With continuous pressure by experts in the families of Greg and Tony, UCLA finally agreed to strengthen its procedures by making changes to the consent forms and assuring closer monitoring of the patients to ensure that they can be rescued from any kind of result, even remotely similar to those of Greg and Tony. I mean, yeah, it's a start, but it's going to take so much more than that, right? I mean, what about the review board who approved the experiment in the first place? Oh, that's right. Review boards are known to approve studies on the basis of the researcher's reputation and patient consent, fully disclosed or not, through an assurance model. In other words, the federal government accepts the judgments without review unless a problem shows up later in the experiment. Just some food for thought. Now, in the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that today's study doesn't have an ending, and that's because it doesn't. You see, to this day, UCLA continues their studies on schizophrenia and its medications. Of course, these studies are almost completely different than they were back in the late 1980s. The studies today are more geared towards how a patient can turn to other alternatives outside of modern medicine to combat their schizophrenia symptoms. These alternatives include living a stress-free lifestyle, diet and exercise, as well as religion and spirituality. However, hardly any valuable data has been found that can amount to the effects of prescription antipsychotics for schizophrenia patients. And that's because when a person is diagnosed with schizophrenia, it is not a single part of the brain that is affected, which is why we still don't have a cure. We can't target a single area of the brain and say, that part right there, that's where the problem is. However, the most affected parts of the brain affected by schizophrenia are the prefrontal and medial temporal lobes, which are involved in working and declarative memory, the hippocampal region, not the hippocampus specifically, but the whole region, the dorsolateral area, again, the whole area, the anterior cingulate gyrus cortex, and the parahippocampal gyrus. And these are just a few to name. Antipsychotic drugs serve as this blockage for dopamine. You see, dopamine is a neurotransmitter, right? Which means that its main job is to pass messages all around the brain. Now, most antipsychotic drugs are known to block some of the dopamine receptors in the brain. This reduces the flow of these messages, which can help reduce the patient's psychotic symptoms. Of course, these antipsychotic drugs are not a cure-all, which is why it's important for patients to live a stress-free, balanced life nonetheless. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. I hope you learned a thing or two about schizophrenia and the government-funded research today. I know I did, that's for sure. If you enjoy the podcast, please remember to give it a like and a follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.